I'm just really delighted to be here to introduce my dear friend and a colleague in the Honors College, Debbie Harwell, who organized this afternoon's event. She teaches for the Honors College, but she's also the managing editor of Houston History. Really a tightly woven tapestry of women's history and civil rights history. Today's panel will focus on the interracial, interfaith, women's-only civil rights group, Wednesdays in Mississippi. That little-known but groundbreaking group of quiet and proper lady activists is also the subject of Professor Harwell's wonderfully insightful and engaging book, Wednesdays in Mississippi, Proper Ladies Working for Radical Change. Freedom Summer 1964. That's the longest title, for heaven's sakes. Her book recently won the Sproul Prize awarded by the Southern Association for Women's Historians for the best book in Southern women's history, right? Good for her. To celebrate her well-deserved award, I invite all of you to stay after the panel's conclusion for Dr. Harwell's book signing. She is a celebrity now, of course. And also for refreshments, but I'm just delighted to be a part of this remarkable gathering this afternoon.
So I want to thank my colleague, Irene Gunther. I would have just said, here's Debbie, she wrote that book. I want to thank all of you all for being here today. You know, when you give an event like this, you're never certain till people start walking in the door, and it was very exciting to see all of you here and to see the enthusiasm that you brought to your conversation. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the people who have supported this to make it possible, which includes Marty Melosi with the Center for Public History Lecture Series, Dr. James Conyers from African American Studies, Dr. Elizabeth Gregory from Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, Naya Blair from the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, as well as Bill Monroe from the Honors College. So thanks to all of them for making this possible. We also want to invite you to continue the conversation on Twitter during and after the panel, including tweeting your questions. I'm not in charge of that, thank goodness. But the information is on the handout that you would have received on your chair. So Wednesdays in Mississippi was the only civil rights project organized by women for women as part of a national women's organization. It was sponsored by the National Council of Negro Women, or NCNW. They brought interracial, interfaith teams of mostly upper and middle class Northern women who were also mostly middle-aged, but not all of them, like Josie. She was just a child when she came. They came down to Jackson, Mississippi during Freedom Summer. But unlike the student activists that we associate with that time period, these women came dressed in their Sunday best, nice dresses, white gloves, as was customary in the 1960s, and they met one-on-one with other women, their counterparts in the South. And they thought that by opening lines of communication in this way and getting women to communicate their concerns with one another, they would realize that they actually shared common goals for their families and their communities. And this kind of understanding was what would ultimately lead to acceptance of an integrated society and Black enfranchisement in the South. So with that in mind, that little brief introduction, I would like to introduce our panelists. And then we're going to show you a clip from a documentary film to give you some more background on Wednesdays in Mississippi. So I'm going to start with the Historically Speaking group. Marlene McCurtis has over 20 years of documentary production experience. She worked as a supervising producer at Arnold Shapiro Productions for 7 years, where she produced several documentaries, including the award-winning film, Hidden Victims, Children of Domestic Violence. Her directing credits include National Geographic's Dog Whisperer, A&E's Emmy-nominated series Beyond Scared Straight, and Peabody Award-winning PBS series A Place of Our Own, Los Niños en su Casa. Wednesdays in Mississippi is our first independent documentary film. The film In Progress has screened at the Athena Film Festival, the Cucaloras Film Festival, the Alice Film Festival, and the Civil Rights Museum. Marlene is a fellow in the Stanley Nelson Firelight Producers Lab. Susie Stedman. So I'm going this way. Susie Stedman was 22 years old when she went to Mississippi in 1964 as the white on-the-ground staff person for WIMS. She continued to work for racial and gender justice at the National Council of Negro Women and the National Women's Committee for Civil Rights. She later worked on international issues at the United Nations and the Ford Foundation in West Africa and New York, and as executive director of Refugees International in Washington, D.C., an advocacy organization for refugee crises around the world. Susie had the privilege of working closely with NCNW President Dorothy Height in creating Height's memoir, Open Wide the Freedom Gates, which I must tell you is what opened the door to WIMS for me. She continues to serve on boards of community and educational organizations, as well as to speak on international affairs. So welcome, Susan. Dr. Josie Johnson began her activism on the streets of Houston with her father, Judson Robinson Sr., fighting the poll tax that prevented African Americans from voting. In the early 1960s, she lobbied professionally for passage of bills concerning such issues as fair housing and employment, and she became a community organizer for the Minneapolis Urban League. She was only 34 years old and a young mother when she came to Jackson with WIMS. One of her daughters, Patrice, was an aide to Congressman Mickey Leland and accompanied him on the humanitarian mission to Ethiopia when their plane was brought down. Josie became the first African American to serve as a regent at the University of Minnesota, where she later taught in the College of Education. After her retirement, the university created the Josie R. Johnson Human Rights and Social Justice Award. She continues to be an advocate for equal rights and social justice. Eureka Gilkey is the executive director of Project Row Houses, established by Rick Lowe in 1993 in Houston's 3rd Ward, to be a catalyst for transforming community through the celebration of art and African American history and culture. A graduate of Howard University who grew up in East Texas, Eureka previously worked as a senior advisor and director of intergovernmental affairs in the Obama administration, director of intergovernmental affairs and outreach for the Democratic National Convention Committee, and a White House liaison for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Dr. Natalie Garza is a professor at Houston Community College, where she teaches U.S. and Mexican American history. Her research interests includes transnational migration, identity formation, popular culture, and Latino and Chicano studies. Natalie also conducted numerous oral history interviews of community members for the Welcome Wilson Houston History Collaborative at the University of Houston, where she received her PhD, and for the Texas Medical Center Women's History Project. She is currently working on a public history project researching Houston's Segundo Barrio for a permanent exhibit at the newly renovated Guadalupe Plaza Park. Kahfa Bachari is an Iranian-American writer and attorney who earned her law degree here at the University of Houston. She is the director of Transactional Law Clinic at the University of Houston Law Center and a corporate attorney at Looper Goodwine PC. Kahfa's writing explores the collective and the personal histories, memories, and myths of Iranians and Iranian Americans. Her work has appeared in Plowshares, Extraordinary Rendition, American Writers on Palestine, and online. Kahfa is also the co-founder of the Pink Iftar at Christ Church Cathedral and sits on the advisory board of the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Rice University. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists. And we're going to begin with the film clip, and I invite you to either turn in your chair or turn your chair so that you can see this screen over here. This won't last all that long, and you'll be able to turn back this way, but this way we're not going to be interrupted by class that comes in later.
Before we show the clip, I just want to kind of prepare you for watching the clip, because it's not going to be what you normally see in terms of a regular kind of movie that you see on television. What you're going to see is what it's called a work in progress. So it's a sample reel of from the film. We're still editing the film. So what that means is that you'll see time code there, you'll see watermarks, the music is temporary, a lot of the images are temporary, and it's not the full story. It's what we use actually to show people a little bit about what the film is about, not telling them too much, but just enough to make them want to maybe not only see more of the film, but when we go to funders to give us money as well. So, so I just wanted to let you know what you're going to see, and it'll be about 13 minutes.
We got involved in civil rights activities as soon as we got there. And our house was always being watched.
I had freedom riders in my house because if they needed a place to sleep, where could they go? As far as my neighbors were concerned, I was a troublemaker.
When my husband desegregated his office, the senior nurse said, "Dr. Hendrick, word is going to get around, and you're going to end up an all-nigger doctor, and I don't intend to be a nigger nurse."
Shut your mouth and stay still. That was the attitude.
We were open about race. We thought it was terrible the way it was. We didn't know what to do.
I was determined that we needed to make a change, and I was going to be a part of that change.
We realized that the women of Jackson were saying to us, "We need help. We need outside help. Please try." So we decided to try. We began to draw up this plan, which became known as Wednesdays in Mississippi.
Polly's and Dorothy's plan was to bring interracial teams of Northern women into Mississippi to meet with Black and white Southern women.
It made a difference that we were not white women over there and Black women over there, but here we were together. If we were going to do anything that's going to be lasting, it needed to be interracial, and that the contribution we could make would be to facilitate those women coming together.
What we're going to do is we're going to go down the line, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists some questions. So if you have questions you would like to ask them, please jot those down or tweet them, and we'll come to your questions at the end. So I'd like to start with Marlene and ask her to please tell us how you got interested in this topic.
Well, thank you, Debbie. I want to thank, actually, Debbie Harwell, Dr. Harwell, for inviting me. And one of the great things about being a filmmaker is that you get to sit on a panel with amazing women like this. So I'm always really honored to be able to participate in any type of panel where I'm sitting with such accomplished, wonderful women. So I feel so honored today. I first found out about Wednesdays in Mississippi through a magazine article, Crisis Magazine. It was on the cover. There was a reunion. And when was that, Susie? 2002. The Children Defense Fund, Marion Wright Elderman, brought together these women for a reunion. And the Crisis Magazine covered it. And I saw that article, and I was really amazed by it for a couple of reasons. First of all, my mother's from Mississippi. So I grew up as a little girl hearing the stories of the segregated South, what it was like growing up in Mississippi. And I always say if this was maybe Wednesdays in Georgia, I don't know if I would have been so attracted to it. But because it was Mississippi, it really resonated with me in a lot of ways. The other thing that drew me to it was this idea of women, particularly middle-class women, that had come together to try to have dialogue, not only to observe the civil rights activities that were going on in Jackson and other places there in Mississippi, but to be active listeners. And this idea of black and white women coming together across religion, across geography, really was very, very kind of appealing to me. So I decided to do some research. I've been working on the film for a very, very long time because I also have my regular job, as Debbie has mentioned, all the other projects I'm working on. So this is my passion project. But over the years, one of the things that I've realized through my adventure of kind of making this film is that we need this model of Wednesdays in Mississippi more today than ever. This model of how do we start to engage each other? How do we start listening to each other instead of talking at each other? And so that I really feel as though Polly and Dorothy truly were on to something, and that was their genius. And so I hope that once the film is done, which it should be finished this year, we're in the editing room, and we're doing our final cuts, and we also have interest from the Mississippi Public Broadcasting to actually air it, and we're hoping that we will get other public television stations along that will also want to air the film. But I really feel it can be such a model for us today, and how do we have meaningful conversations, and then what grows out of that conversation, because a lot grew out of Wednesdays in Mississippi. It went beyond the conversation, and it moved into actual action, including housing, childcare, things like that. But it started with women coming together and just imagining what they could do.
Okay, thank you. Susie, you were the first person, basically, you and Doris and Dion were the first people to arrive there in Mississippi. Could you tell us a little bit about the steps that you went through and the challenges that you faced as a staff member trying to set up and execute Wednesdays in Mississippi?
I would be happy to, and I would also like to second Marlene's thanks and what an honor it is to be among such distinguished, wonderful women, including you. Mississippi was a very dangerous place in 1964. The Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council were determined to make it the last bastion of segregation. It was a war zone. Death was a daily possibility. You couldn't believe you were in the United States of America. And you didn't know whom you could trust. And you did know that if you trusted someone whom you shouldn't have, you would be betrayed. By the end of the summer, by early August, actually, 6 people were dead. 80 people had been killed or beaten. 1,000 had been arrested, and 67 homes, churches, and businesses had been burned or bombed. Another challenge was the rampant misinformation about the movement, about Black people, about the volunteers in Freedom Summer, about anyone from the outside, that was perpetrated by the media, by the chief of the FBI, by local and state officials, and by ministers from the pulpit. It was never Neverland. Another challenge for me was, and I think for many of the team members, was going back and forth between the Black and white communities. The wall was so great between them that it was dizzying and debilitating. However, the only time I really felt safe was when I was in the Black community. Specific challenges that I faced was finding a place to live. Because my job was to get through to white women, I had to be, as you know, beyond respectability. In fact, I looked for a pair of white gloves to wear today, and I couldn't find any. Anyhow, I wound up living in a place called Magnolia Towers, which was the poshest apartment place building in Jackson at the time. It was owned by members of the White Citizens Council. And if they had known that, what I was doing, they actually thought I was a call girl. I mean, they couldn't figure out why I was there. My rent check was paid by the National Council of Negro Women. Well, needless to say, it got laundered several times before it reached them. Another challenge was finding a place to meet with Doris, my black counterpart. We couldn't be seen together in public. She couldn't walk into my building. I couldn't go to her house, where she was staying with a black family. Finally, Lily Bell Jones, who was the director of the branch YWCA, meaning the black YWCA, took a deep breath and said, okay, Susie, if you don't stay too long and you don't tell anyone, you can meet Doris in my back room, so that we could plan each week's arrival and activities for the teams coming down. And so that's what I did, but another challenge was figuring out how to get to the black Y. I couldn't go in a white taxi. I couldn't ride in a black taxi. So I figured it out. I took a white taxi to the Sun and Sands Motel, which was sort of on the border of the black community, crept through the crepe myrtle, looking longingly at the swimming pool. It was 110 degrees, and walked the 6 blocks to the branch Y. Another challenge was meeting the teams at the airport. Doris and I would be there, standing, 20 yards from one another, and we couldn't acknowledge, it couldn't be known that we knew each other, much less that we were friends. And that was just weird. And trying to get local women to come to meet our visiting teams. I must have made 40 calls before I got the first 5 women to come together to meet other white women. And finally, keeping everybody safe once they were there was also a challenge.
How important was the image of the proper ladies to negotiating this life in Mississippi?
Absolutely critical. Because if we looked like the women we wanted to meet and be with, and if we hadn't, there would never have been any connection. But because we did, and we respected their values, we might not have agreed with them, but we understood that we needed to respect them. We also totally disarmed the rural, gun-toting, self-appointed law-enforcing men who would encounter us in the hinterlands. Each week, we took each team out to a different freedom school or voter registration project in the hinterlands, in Canton or Hattiesburg or Vicksburg or Greenburg. And we'd get there, and these guys would be following us in their trucks with their guns on top and their angry dogs inside. And we'd stop and we'd get out of the car in our pearls and our white gloves and say, "Good morning, officer." And they just sort of melt in total confusion about who we were. I think the most important aspect of what we did was that we listened. And we did not demonstrate. We came as observers, and because we were interested in talking about problems that face the entire nation, not just Mississippi. Mississippi women felt comfortable talking with us, and once they opened up to us, they were able to open up to each other. And they began to realize they could be forces for change, and they knew they had to do this. They knew that segregation was not sustainable and had become illegal with the Civil Rights Act. And they needed to do this for their children. We encountered women who'd been playing bridge together for decades, but had never gone below the surface of their small talk, who discovered that they had common concerns. As Mrs. Tilley of the Fellowship of Reconciliation used to say, women don't have political power. They don't have financial power, but we are the shock absorbers. That's our role, and that's what we did. And another Mississippi woman said, when you combine experience, determination, knowledge, understanding, and a desire to help with femininity, you have a force to be reckoned with. So,
Can you give us some examples of some of the successes and failures
Oh,
that
my.
you observed?
well, you know, I have had many failures in my life, and I've now in my 75th year, I appreciate what a gift they are and how much one can learn from them. But we did absolutely have to walk a tightrope of sympathizing with the predicament these women found themselves in and helping them see through to the end. I think your description, Debbie, in your book of Team 5's meeting was typical, with a group of local women who went back and forth between talking about these barbarians who've invaded our state, and because of the misinformation, the volunteers were all, you know, no one had ever met any of these kids. They were northern students who had come down, but they were called communist beatnik prevert Jews. It was all one word, prevert included. And they had no idea. And they'd talk about their sons and daughters who were going to Harvard and Princeton. Well, quite a few of the COFO workers were also going to Harvard and Princeton. And gradually, so we discovered these commonalities. But this group of women went sort of back and forth between talking about us barbarians invading the state and then how terrible everything was, and they would have to take care of it. And it was dizzying, and I've often thought since if Martha Graham might have, or Alvin Ailey could have done choreographed an amazing ballet of these twists and turns in this conversation that we had, and that was sort of typical. Another initial failure that turned out to be a success was with Mary Hendrick, whom you saw in the film, who towards the end of the summer was very interested in having one of the members of the Princeton team, oh, help me, the governor's wife.
Helen Miner.
Helen Miner, thank you. Come to stay with him, not because she was the former governor's wife or the head of the American Red Cross. She was a Presbyterian, and that was what was most important. I went to church 3 times every Sunday because that's where I would meet people. And I'd sit through sermons about brotherhood, which was hard. Anyhow, Mrs. Hendrick wanted to have Mrs. Miner stay with her, which was a coup because the black women all stayed with families, but the white women had to stay in a motel. But the day before the Princeton team was arriving, someone else called me and said, Susie, the Hendricks can't have Mrs. Miner with them. They have an issue in their church that is a hot dispute, and they fear that if they do this radical thing of having this northern woman stay in their house, it will jinx the vote in the church. So I said, fine, and put Mrs. Miner in the motel. 3 days after Mrs. Miner had come and gone, I got a call from Mary Hendrick saying, Susie, Jim and I are so embarrassed and so sad, and we've talked about nothing but our inability to have Mrs. Miner, and we're so sorry, and so forth. And I said, well, I'm sorry too. But she said, you know, we're not free, are we? And I said, no, Mary, you're not any freer than the blackest person in this state. And that was an epiphany for Mary Hendrick, and she became one of the leaders for graceful integration going forward. So, what else? I think for the black community, we, and Josie can certainly speak more to this, but we gave a support and encouragement and a link to the outside world, and an inkling that not all white people were creatures of the devil, and that there might be a hope for their children. So another reason I think we were successful is because we were working outside of the male-dominated power structure of the civil rights movement, which had its own constraints, and we did not have them. So by the end of the summer, our 48 women had met with over 300 Mississippi women. And when we had a meeting that fall to assess what had happened, had anything important happened, and if so, were there any next steps? And the Mississippi women who came to that meeting said, you can't stop now, you've got to come back. This is more than a one summer project. So I'm done more than my time, sorry.
Josie, I'd like to turn to you as the team member and ask you to tell us what inspired you to take part in Wednesdays in Mississippi and how you felt it furthered the civil rights movement.
Well, thank you very much. It's hard to follow all that has been said so far because we had a general pattern of action, behavior, and assessment. My team, there were 4 of us from Minnesota. The woman who was head of the National Council of Jewish Women, one National Council of Christian Women, and then the 2 of us were from different religious backgrounds, 2 Black women. What our team, the responsibility we had, was to try and understand what was going on in Jackson, Mississippi, in the plan for voter registration, to be an observer and to try and collect the information we needed in order to provide that to Dorothy Height and others who were working on the Civil Rights, Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was an interesting thing. My team members, 2 whites and 2 blacks, we were instructed before we left Minneapolis in the instructions given to teams that we could sit together and talk together until we got to Chicago. Once we arrived in Chicago, because that's where you changed planes, we then had to be a segregated team and could pretend we didn't know each other. I had this great fear that when we got to Jackson, to the airport, nephew, there would be the Klan waiting for us. When we arrived, the woman who was my partner was the editor of the Black newspaper in St. Paul. And we waited for our host to arrive. And when she did, it was such a relief to have someone meet us who was anticipating our arrival. And she took us immediately to this large African-American church in Jackson, where the assembled group was being instructed on voter registration. And we observed, as Debbie shared with you, these men patrolling the building to protect us with shotguns. We were in the building listening, and the reaction of so many of the people there who could hardly believe that it was so difficult to register to vote. And when we left the church, we went to a small Black restaurant, and the proprietor of that restaurant urged us not to talk in public because people would detect that we were not Southerners and we would be in danger. The things that we did, we went to a freedom school in Vicksburg, and as it was described, there was a car following us to Vicksburg. When we arrived, there were these wonderful young people working their hearts out to create libraries, to create comfortable seating areas for the students, and to collect all the materials that many of you may have sent to Jackson during that time to create education. Because you remember, when the Brown decision was ruled by the court, they closed all the schools in Jackson and other parts of the South, so that Black children no longer had a public school to attend. And the Freedom School movement then took shape to try and educate our children. So we went to one, met these wonderful young people, watched the work they were doing. When we left the Freedom School, that night it was bombed and destroyed, all the work that those young people had done. We went through Jackson when we left, through Vicksburg when we left, and met families, and it was very touching because many of the black families that we met were in the shadows of the plantation. So it wasn't as if, excuse me, there had been such a difference since the Brown decision and the Emancipation Proclamation. So we went then to the court to watch what happened to young black children in those court settings. We went to meet with clergy who were afraid to speak about voter rights or any of the issues associated with civil rights in their pulpits because they didn't know who was sitting in the church and might report them. They expressed a real deep concern about that and felt that they were not fulfilling their responsibility as religious and clergy. And so we talked to them about the movement so that they had an understanding. The one joy was going to Tougaloo College. Tougaloo is a black historic school in Jackson, Mississippi, and it was identified as the oasis of the South. And it had an integrated faculty, and people gathered there, and they were free to talk about the issues of the Voter Rights Act. The experience we had was really scary because having grown up right here in Houston, Texas, Mississippi had a very different image for all of us. And the fact that we were there and could see the treatment of African American people, which was different than I had observed here in Houston, thank God. But it was denial, it was intimidation. The threats that were there, the 3 young civil rights workers, if you will remember, were lost. They couldn't find them, didn't know where they were. And they were found immediately after we left Jackson, Mississippi. My sense, my people, is that the work that was created around us, the attitude of complete secrecy, before we left Minneapolis, we were told that only the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, was to know that we were going. No one except your immediate family, and that was your husband, your wife, your children, knew that you were there. When you came back, you were also under the threat of secrecy, so we couldn't talk about our experience. We wrote it and sent our report to Dorothy Height, who was assisting in drafting the materials that were needed for the Voting Rights Act. But it wasn't until there was a sense on the part of the Attorney General that we were free and would not endanger the work that was going on in Jackson and other parts of Mississippi. So, Debbie, it was an experience that I think lingers yet. And what I hope is that it doesn't go for naught. Because what happens so often is that we go through it, and if we live through it, we forget what we went through, and we sort of live as we did the day before. So that was part of our experience.
You had
And
mentioned.
the reason I went, you're absolutely right, the question, why and what I thought. I had known Dorothy Height for many years. Dorothy and I served on the National Board of Delta Sigma Theta, my sorority, and she was president of the National Council of Negro Women. So I knew her, and we had a relationship. So when Dorothy calls, you respond. So that was one of the reasons. I figured if she was engaged in it, knowing her history and involvement and commitment, then it must be worth it. And my husband and I agreed that he could take care of those girls if something happened to me.
You shouldn't have to make that choice. You had mentioned in the film, and you talked a bit in your response about voting rights and what you observed when you first got to Mississippi. How do you think that struggle for voting rights then compares to what is happening today?
I see some people in this audience who could probably answer that very well. For me, observing what is going on nationally in the whole category of voter rights is of great trouble. Someone said the then and the now, right? The objective prior to 1965 was to deny us voting at all in any form. As a girl, having worked with my activist father, trying to collect petitions to do away with the poll tax in Texas, which had been put in place in 1902 and really didn't give it up until 1967, 2 years after the legislation. To then see that we had the right, Black people and others who had been denied the right were exercising it. And it was so clear in 2008 when people sacrificed and stood in rain and snow and cold to vote, to practice what they had wanted all their life. And then to see the Supreme Court rule and take away the section of the Voter Rights Act which required that those states, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, etc., would have to prove that they were no longer denying or creating a problem for voting. The Supreme Court removed that, and it then opened the floodgates, as you know, here in Texas, to make voting difficult. And so, in my view, it's very important, in addition to what our panelists have asked you tonight, that you pay attention to what is being done relative to the gains that we've tried to make, and they've been slowly withdrawn bit by bit. And the language is sometimes difficult for people because the laws are not there that deny us, but the intent is there. So I beg you to pay attention to language, action, outcome, so that you can exercise your citizen right by protecting all of us who need protection yet. This is 2016. And, you know, some have given their age, and I'm now 85, which means it hasn't been long since we were freed, right? And that's sort of a sad thing. I don't know if you want to, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we've definitely come a long way in some respects, but in other respects, as your answer indicates, we still have a ways to go. And in some ways, we've regressed. We still have to remind ourselves that Black Lives Matter. We still have elected officials who try to obstruct the right to vote. And we even have a presidential candidate today who's calling for blatant discrimination against a particular religious group, which is, of course, not in our precepts of freedom of religion. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to our 3 young women on the panel. Not that we're not all young, but our Houston women who just got the right to vote last week. And because they only just turned of age. So I'd like to start with Eureka. And Eureka, I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about Project Row Houses, which has as its mission, as I said earlier, to serve as a catalyst for transforming the community through art and African American history and culture. And I'd like to know how Project Row Houses interacts with the community to generate greater understanding of the challenges that are faced in the African American community, and also the value of Third Ward to our community in the greater Houston area.
Well, and for the record, I'm 40.
Wow. I wouldn't have guessed.
So, as Dr. Harwell said, Project Row Houses it's a unique organization. It's a community-based arts organization that uses art as a social practice to affect change within the community. And we are located in historic Northern Third Ward, which at one time, the land that we occupy now was once considered the most dangerous neighborhood in Houston. And so our founder, Rick Lowe, was on a bus tour with some elected officials back in 1993. And what the elected officials saw as blight and crime and poverty, he saw it as an opportunity for him and the other 6 founders to use art in a way that was accessible to the community and change the landscape. So what Project Row Houses does with art is it provides a platform for artists who may be underrepresented, whether they're artists of color or women. But it also responds to a need within the community. For instance, at one point, actually 20 years ago, in 1996, the artists looked around after they had renovated the row houses and saw that there were a high number of single mothers in the neighborhood. So they started the Young Mothers Residential Program, which is a 2-year program that provides a social safety net for mothers who need help getting through school, getting on their feet. It's a very rigorous program. They have to be in school, work. They have a curfew. They can't have overnight male guests, which is interesting. But it provides that safety net. So once they're technically homeless. So once they got out of the program, what do they do next? So we started Row House CDC, which provides affordable housing for low to moderate income families in the neighborhood. Through that, we also partner with local community organizations, whether it's Shape Community Center or targeting Blackshear Elementary School, which is a failing school in the neighborhood, and arts education has been taken out of the neighborhood. So we got grant money to start an after-school program with the school this year so kids could have an opportunity to see art and use their creative talents through this program that wouldn't be provided because they no longer have money for it. But what we're facing now in Northern Third Ward is what a lot of urban communities are facing, and it's gentrification. And gentrification in that area it's sad, but I like change, but the way the developers are targeting this neighborhood right now and not taking into account the culture of Emancipation Park, which is 2 blocks from Project Row Houses, a park that most of you should know was deeded to the city by freed slaves. It's undergoing a $40 million renovation right now, which means developers are looking at the land throughout Northern Third Ward as a hot spot. So Project Row Houses has taken the lead working with faith institutions and small business owners and homeowners to try to change the dialogue on how you develop that area. If you don't have a car in that neighborhood, it's a 45-minute bus ride to get to Fiesta at 59 in Main. You can literally get to 5 liquor stores faster than you can get to a fresh piece of produce. Mm-hmm. So Project Grow Houses invests in those ways. So we invested money to this former Trader Joe's sales associate because she wanted to start a food co-op, and it's the only place in the neighborhood now that you can get a fresh piece of, you can walk in and get a banana. So gentrification is our biggest priority in trying to, we can't say halt it because residents are being displaced as we speak right now, but at least try to make sure that the people that have been there through the good, the bad, and the ugly aren't displaced, and creating this sustainable ecosystem, whether it's through our partners here at the University of Houston or other private developers, to try to create some real sustainable jobs for this community. Does that answer your question?
That's great, thank you. Mm-hmm. Natalie, I'd like to turn to the Latino community, which is our largest ethnic group in the city now. And you've conducted a number of oral histories, which you did for us, kindly, that I know covered people in all different types of walks of life, people who work behind the scenes and people who are in the front lines of political activism. What could you tell us about what you observed about Latinas and how they worked in the community, what causes they worked for and their methods, et cetera?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of diversity within the causes and the methods used. And so I think you see a range of women who were involved in what might be considered more radical groups and engaging in like street protests or taking over buildings and interrupting school board meetings and that kind of thing. The organization in Houston that did that was MAYO, the Mexican American Youth Organization. And so there were women involved in that who wanted to become active in that way. And my sense of why they chose those kinds of strategies is because they felt like there was no alternative, that they felt like they tried other methods, and they made requests through proper channels and things like that, and it went unheard. And so the decision was the only other alternative to get attention and make needs known was to be more radical in their activism. And the decision was conscious. The decision was conscious to not accommodate to the demands of other people, and that they were going to engage in that kind of activity. But then there were other women that wanted to work through the church, for example. You know, Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church is a big Mexican American community church. And there were women who became active through that, you know, through their religion in that way. And so out of that, they joined up in kind of a interfaith organization, particularly to combat immigration and issues in the 1980s. And I don't think the organization that was created, and the name is kind of slipping my mind right now, but I don't think the organization that was created at that time still exists. But like I said, there was women who decided to work through kind of that organization rather than engaging in activism in terms of like being in protests or marching or anything like that, but to work through that interfaith community and trying to find solutions and maybe, you know, offering safe havens for refugees and things like that. And then women involved in kind of larger Latino organizations like LULAC, the League for United Latin American Citizens, and you know, working towards things like education was a big thing, wanting to have equal access to education and opportunities in the schools in Houston. But you know, there are women heavily involved in LULAC still today that continue to fight for working through the system is what I see it as, right? That they see problems that exist and are trying to figure out ways to adjust things from within. So for example, I interviewed a woman who's involved with LULAC and wanted to make sure that she got on grand juries, right? She wanted to be on the grand jury. And so she was talking to me about it, and she said, you don't know how important it is to have, you know, Latinos and diverse populations on the grand jury, because they're making the decisions of, you know, who's getting indicted, right? Who has to answer for injustices and things like that. So that's an example, right, of women who are looking at these broader systemic problems and how they can work within it, within the Latino community, right, how they can work within it to make change. Currently, the project that I'm working on with Guadalupe Plaza Park is, I think, also kind of an issue of gentrification. I think that the community, Guadalupe Plaza Park, if you don't know, is in 2nd Ward. And so there's a lot of, you know, renovation happening throughout the community. And community members who have been there for a long time feel like they're not being included in the discussions and that they're being pushed out. And so the renovation of the park, people demanded that they be included, and they went to city council. They were a little bit more pushy also because they called the media, and that got a response. And so, you know, I think you're right, the change is coming anyway, but the demands of the community with that park is that they at least be recognized, and that the history of the neighborhood be recognized. And it was women who were leading that effort to make the city accountable, that the history is documented. So.
Okay, thank you. Kahfa, in 2009, you and a group of friends formed the Pink Iftar, which was an interfaith, multicultural bringing together of women at Christ Church Cathedral, led by Muslim women at each table, and some smaller group meetings during Women's History Month. Could you talk a little bit about your motivation for forming Pink Iftar and what you feel like breaking bread together brings about?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. The Pink Iftar actually started years before that. I was, sometimes activism comes to you, and I happen to have been in a meeting with a dear friend, both of them who are here, Maida Sofskin, Muffy Maroney, who I want to recognize. But Maida and I had been friends. I'd worked with her husband at a law firm. And she mentioned that they were doing an interfaith Seder at Christ Church Cathedral. And I said, oh, can a Muslim come? And she said, yes, absolutely. And so I went to a women's interfaith Seder at Christ Church Cathedral, and it was a beautiful program, and I had never experienced something like that. We sat around, and we had, there were maybe 6 to 8 different tables led by these amazing Jewish women who were leading a Seder with a Haggadah that was a feminist Haggadah that went through the story of Passover and Jewish tradition and history, but all through the perspective of women, strong, amazing women in that faith tradition. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And so later, I had a group of friends, mostly Iranian American friends, and all of us were at that stage in our lives where we had small babies and we'd get together for brunch and, you know, try and keep each other sane. And we often complained about the representation of Muslims in the media and how it didn't fit with anything that we knew about our own experiences, and maybe even some of us would describe ourselves as Muslim, but we were kind of fit with that narrative, and we were constantly put in a position of having to defend against that narrative or react to that narrative, which is a way of controlling the narrative. And so we said, why don't we do something like what the Jewish ladies are doing with Christ Church Cathedral? Why don't we get together and have women conversationalists who are from Muslim faith backgrounds, that is, Muslim women who might be called Muslim but are so diverse. We had women who define themselves as queer, women who, like me, thought of themselves as maybe without faith. That was an evolving issue for me. Women who were Orthodox and covered themselves and veiled themselves and prayed 5 times a day. We wanted a whole range of women to come and lead conversations at tables with women from other faith backgrounds, and then to do it over amazing food, which seems to me like a great way to start a conversation. And so we did it. We did the first one, and we had over 200 people, I think, attend. We had a lecture in the actual cathedral of the church by Dr. Alora Shahabuddin, who's a scholar over at Rice University, and she gave like a Women and Islam 101 to all of our participants, and then everybody adjourned at the, you know, it was during Ramadan, so the iftar dinner happens after the sun sets. And we had the call to prayer inside a Christian church, and everybody went to, you know, some women went to pray, other of us went to eat, but those women who went to pray did it all together on these gorgeous, beautiful Persian rugs, and I mean, it was a really beautiful experience. And I think that one of the things that was particularly lovely about it is how we all came together, how it all worked together, how the committee putting this event together was from so many different backgrounds. And those of us on the committee learned so much about each other and about ourselves just through this active, you know, engaged dialogue. It was such an act of compassion, really, to talk through with counterparts who you might disagree with on issues, but to respect them, to respect their values and have a conversation and have, was it a ministry of listening? That the Ministry of Presence, just being there and hearing, you know, and seeing even the Muslim women that I recruited. Some of them, for example, my Iranian American counterparts who had left Iran after the revolution, who had a very particular view of Islam, for me to convince them to come on to this event and speak about your experience. Even for them, it was something completely new, and they'd never thought of themselves as able to contribute to the narrative about Muslim women in our community. So it was empowering, it was fun, and we expanded it, and we had smaller dinners in the homes of women of Muslim faith backgrounds during Women's History Month, and those were really successful in terms of just bringing people together to have conversations. I know I had a friend who lived out in Kingwood, is it? Suburb of Dallas, right?
Yeah.
North of Houston. She brought a friend, and her friend was convinced that we would try and convert her, which, you know, was silly. And she realized that, and we had a great, you know, kind of engagement about it. And I know that there are some friendships that have grown from women attending these dinners. We'd like to continue that kind of work and do more of that kind of work because it is so incredibly necessary. Every day I wake up and I realize that interfaith work, work around dialogue and bringing anybody really together to have a civilized conversation in this country is so important, but also having a major challenge. Yeah, absolutely. And even just having the understanding that we want to do this through compassion and understanding that everybody comes to the table with their views and their ideas because of their particular experience, and we have to respect that they're human beings too. And in order for us to make any positive change in the world, we have to engage with them on their terms as well as our own.
Thank you. So I'd like to give you the opportunity now to ask questions of any of our panelists. Don't be shy. Jerry?
Did you all do WIMS-based
was Panel of American Women. Mhm.
I think you're talking about the Panel of American Women. It was called the Panel of American Women, and it was originally started actually in Little Rock after the whole desegregation that happened there at the high school. A group of women got together and they would do these panels. You'd have an African American woman, a Jewish woman, a Catholic woman, a Presbyterian woman, and they would be invited. They would never go any place where they weren't invited, but they would be invited and they would come and they would talk to groups and they would just talk about their experiences. And I do believe there was one in New Orleans. I know there was one in Jackson. You know a little bit as well. I think there was one in New Orleans. I'm sure obviously there was one in New Orleans.
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
The Wednesday's experience was unique because it was inspired by Freedom Summer. But 40 years later, Marion Wright Edelman called me and said, Susie, I want to use Wednesdays in Mississippi as a model for my work at the Children's Defense Fund. And she did for a while. And I want to reune the women who went, will you please find them? 100 women, 40 years later, in 7 cities, who had been known at the time mostly as Mrs. John Jones. Thank God for Google. Anyhow, I found, in the sense of determining whether they were alive or dead, and if they were alive, where they were, 70-some of the 100. And how many came? I don't know. Well, of those 70, several were gone, alas. But we reunited in Washington in 2002, which inspired the article that Marlene read. Anyhow, it was a joyful occasion, needless to say.
Called by Marion.
Yes, yes, it was part of her annual convention of the Children's Defense Fund.
Benny?
In 1958, when I graduated from Middlesex. And I've often wondered, I'm kind of driven by guilt ever since that I didn't stay, and that's still me. And I've often wondered if I would have had the courage. And I had never heard of this group until Debbie, I knew about her book, her dissertation. And I just can't say thank you enough for those of us who maybe just didn't have the courage.
Thank you.
It's something that will let you know, things are still not perfect there. They're not perfect here either. We still have lots of work to do.
They're not perfect anywhere.
But I wanted to tell you something that made me realize that some things had changed. I had a daughter who was a freshman at Ole Miss 3 years ago, reared in Texas, but she was over there in school. And James Meredith came to campus for some kind of conference or meeting. She had her picture made with James Meredith. And she was so excited. She did not really, of course, didn't associate with the past, but she just knew he was somebody who would make a difference. And sent me the picture on
Love it.
of James Meredith with my granddaughter. So you did make a difference.
Thank you. I'm sure you would have been one of our angels had you been there. And I have to say, people said, "Oh my God, Susie, you were so young and white and stupid, and how did weren't you scared?" And of course I was. But to look at the Mississippi women who sponsored us, really, who invited us, and made it possible for us to do what we did, black and white both. Their courage was just extraordinary, and their courage gave me mine.
There's
Lenore?
the hand right here.
Lenore. Oh, somebody else? I didn't see
She's had her hand
Oh,
up.
I'm sorry. You can go next.
Susie, when you had your conversations when you were in Jackson, Mississippi, what was the content of the conversations?
Well, it was clear that Mississippi was in a state of siege. I mean, literally, as far as they were concerned, by this invasion of 1,000 students who'd come down. But there was paralysis. I mean, nobody could trust anybody. People worried about how to keep safe from their neighbors. The first coffee that we had with those first brave 5 women, the first neighbor who walked into the hostess's house went around the living room and closed the curtains. This was 10 o'clock in the morning. And the hostess said, "Barbara, what are you doing?" And she said, "If anyone sees me here, if my husband sees me here, he'll divorce me. It will be the end of the world." So, as I said, we came to listen, and first, inevitably, the substance of the initial conversation among the white women, it was very different among the black women, was how terrible it was that the outside world was trying to fix Mississippi's problems, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then we'd say, well, what about this? And we also began reporting back to the local women after we had gone out to the freedom schools, because as far as they were concerned, these kids were sitting around smoking pot and sleeping together and not doing anything useful. And in fact, what Josie described, these amazing freedom schools, and this was a sociological phenomenon that was going on all over this state that no one really knew about because they were told it wasn't happening. So we would come back and report what we had seen. And because we were respectable, they listened and they heard. And by the end of the summer, we had local Mississippi women who wanted to go with us out into the hinterlands to see the freedom schools. And so it was very gradual, it was very incremental, it was very slow. But little by little, people felt safe enough to, kind of stick their noses up over the covers and see what was going on outside. And then they began to realize the work that needed to be done.
Lenore?
I find this very, very unique and interesting just because, in history, when we learn about these things, it's usually learning about protests and marches, which seem more radical than what you guys did, but just hearing y'all stories makes me realize that it really wasn't so radical in comparison. But what made you guys choose this route instead of doing marches and protesting and such?
I'll let Josie answer that, but I think it was because we thought it would be more effective.
As you know, historically, we've always had protests of some kind. Dorothy believed in organizing and talking with people. And so when she talked about the interest in bringing people together, remember, she worked for the YWCA that was working always at trying to create environments of safety and integration. So that was a part of her life's mission. When the times that I knew her closely with my sorority and with the National Council, she was still talking about bringing people together. So I believe when the conversation about bridging this gap and looking at the condition of our people in Mississippi and in Jackson, where I had opportunity to work, it was pitiful to know that children could not be educated and that men were losing their jobs when they mentioned voter registration, or when children were put in jail when their parents were involved in it. So I'm sure what Dorothy did, and this is sort of taking a great leap for me because I wasn't in her environment as she talked about this particular project, but I would imagine having observed that protests last for a while. But what you really need to do is to get at the hearts of people, talk to them, get them engaged personally, not just in a group, but personally. And I'm assuming, knowing Dorothy, that that's what she did, she and Polly, in working out, how do you do that? And I believe today, my friends, conversation is what's going to save this nation, because we're very afraid to talk to each other. And she knew that if you brought us together, as Susie said, the commonality would emerge, and that's what we can work with.
If I could just add, there also was the imminent threat of integration, which people realized was happening, that they were going to have to change. And they were, the women, the white women, and certainly the black women, were concerned for their children. And they wanted to make it as graceful and unviolent as possible. And I think that was a huge motivating factor for the white women especially to get involved.
Cecilia?
So when I was reading Debbie's book, it was such an eye-opener for me. I actually went to school my freshman year in Hattiesburg.
Oh,
and
wow.
I was there for the first year that they ever showed the Rocky Horror Picture Show and saw a number of men walking around in drag. It was really a very transcendent experience.
What year was that?
That was 1985.
Oh, my.
It was a hoot. But there was still some racial divide, but I experienced a little bit of that. But when I was reading Debbie's book, one of the experiences that I've had was an instinct at some of the grossest stories of abuse, of wanting to hurl the book against the wall. I was so upset and angry. And I come from a family where there are generations before me who will very blatantly make comments that are bigoted, that just, curl my ears. And it kills me. There's lots of fights that end up happening in my family. I want to know about how it was for you, Susie and Josie, to do this and forgive. You were encountering this on a daily basis, and you lived this. You watched people change and not change. You've seen heinous violations of rights. And how is it that you don't throw everything against the wall?
Well, from the perspective of our culture as a people, African American people, I think we have always felt, if you'll, in knowing our history as many of you do, from the days of slavery, of believing that the Bible and somebody was going to be good to us and free us of the abuse and denial that was being fostered on us. So I think it's hope. It's the constant belief that someday something is going to happen that's going to create an opportunity for all of us. And I think you just continue to hold on that. And what you do is grab every little piece that you find. Now, there's some of us that I think may not be as patient as others, but I think the hope is always there, even for those who feel the need to stop doing what their old elders have done and to take another approach. But it's still hope. It's hope. I think faith, religious faith, regardless of the denomination or spiritual belief, is a part of that culture. That's the best I can do. I've got some young people here, relatives, who might be able to give you a different answer.
I think one thing that sort of carried me was an understanding that the women we were talking with weren't bad people. They were caught in a system and in a predicament that still, alas, pervades our society. And the systemic racism and beliefs, as Josie was talking about this morning in Debbie's class, that black people are inferior, that they can't be educated, that they're not good family people, and so forth. It's just built in, it's just ingrained in our DNA, and we have to understand that that isn't so. And the way we do that is by talking to people who look different from us so that we can find our common ground. And that's what we tried to do.
We have a tweet question. Very excited.
Modern technology wins.
We have a question if there is a crowdfunding link to help fund the documentary.
Yay! If not, when are you starting it?
Well, we haven't started our crowdfunding, but we probably will in the next couple of months. But if you're interested in finding out more about the project, there's two ways. One, we have cards up here which you can take. That doesn't help the person that's there online, but also you can go to our website, and it's WIMSfilmproject.com, WIMS filmproject.com, and also we're on Facebook, Wednesdays in Mississippi Film Project. Please like us on Facebook because that always helps. And if you go to our website and also continue to go to our Facebook page, you can find out more about the film's progress, as well as you can make a donation to the film even before we have our crowdfunding going on, because we are under Women Make Movies, so we can take donations because they are 501c. So, yay!
Great question. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have two questions for the younger generation.
Yes, good. Yes.
I just wondered if you would comment on how often it is that you call on the experiences of people like the women involved in Wednesdays in Mississippi. And then for the women who were active in Wednesdays in Mississippi, you talked about how you had to get through space. The other challenge of that time was the phone system and party lines. Were you ever able to use telephones? And if you didn't, was it strictly or mostly related to the issue of party lines and operators who connected phone calls?
You know, that is the very first time that I've ever heard anything about telephones. And isn't that interesting? Because I grew up in the period of party lines and the difficulty of getting through. But I don't think we used telephones at all.
Well,
during that time.
We were not on party lines, but we were concerned that we were being bugged. Mm-hmm. And so we did have to be careful.
Mm-hmm. And what about that 800 number, that number you would call for the White Citizens Council?
Oh, well, yeah, you could, there was an 800 number you could call to hear the spiel of the White Citizens Council. The other number that was important was the secret number of the NAACP, because the Tuesday night rallies, they were always on Tuesday night, which was great for the black members of the team to go to these amazing rallies every week. And every now and then, when I couldn't find any white women to talk to my ladies, we'd sort of take a deep breath and go too. But to find out where they were going to be, they were in a different place every week, so to try to elude the cops. And so I had this number that I used like a floating crap game, and I'd call the number to find out where the meeting was going to be that night.
Never thought of a phone. I didn't, nor my team. Yeah, so thank you for asking that. I would think
That's, by the way, this is Dr. Linda Reed. She's in our history department. She was one of the advisors on my dissertation.
Very good.
Thank you.
I'm eager to hear the young women's point of view. These young people.
Yeah, second part of the question.
I mean, I was inspired by women who are from a different generation than me to do this work, and I'm inspired by their stories and struggles and just in their own stories about how they've overcome issues in their lives. And I hope that I'm wise enough to learn from that, and hope that others around me will too in these conversations that we have. I feel so humbled to just hear your stories and
think of how far we've come and yet how far we have to go. It's really inspiring, and it just makes you take a step back, a breath.
I agree. I mean, as it was said earlier, I've conducted a lot of oral histories of women, and you know, always asking questions of wanting to get stories about struggle and things like that. And so I am often motivated and inspired by the stories, but one of the things that sticks out to me is that they don't want to discuss that often, right? They often overlook the struggle and focus on what it took to accomplish what they needed to accomplish. And so that's been a lesson to me of not focusing on the difficulty and believing that you know, you can accomplish things, and focusing on that instead, because I always, like I said, I always think, but wasn't it hard? And they say, yeah, it was hard, but this is what I did. And so that's been a lesson.
I think for me, you can't do the work that I do without consulting those who have come before you, right? So I often have like sage advice hours, you know, at least once a week. You know, sitting here with these esteemed panelists, I think we all had this feeling like, why are we on this panel? You know? So, you know, hopefully, you know, we'll continue the conversation. But just the work that I do in the neighborhood where I work, it's just impossible for me to be in the position that I'm in without talking to the elders.
Any other?
Oh, well, I just was curious, in your work in Jackson, did you get any support from Millsaps College at all? Faculty or anybody?
Go ahead. I did not. I didn't seek it. It might have been there. My team was responsible. Each team had assignments that may have been different in some minor detail. And my team did not go beyond the assignment that we took on in Jackson, and that was to get the kind of information I
was thinking as a matter of support. I had some faculty members that in the late 50s that I think would have been in support of this, and I just wondered again.
Well, Tougaloo.
There were individuals associated with Millsaps who supported us. The college certainly did not itself. I mean, they couldn't. Tougaloo was also a haven.
Yes, I
Yeah.
know you mentioned that.
Yeah.
That's why I wondered if Millsaps.
So we had a question here and then over here. Well, I'm coming to you next.
My colleague, Muffy Moroni, as she was leaving, said, ask them something about sexism. So, all right, we came at our interfaith work because it's faith work, and having spent time with Kahfa and with Muffy, it's clear that, at least for the three Abrahamic faiths, there's a heavy layer of sexism in all three. That even when there are claims that the original document wasn't sexist, it certainly has developed a sexist veneer that's thousands of years old. To the extent that you've worked in civil rights, have you had to struggle with sexism as well?
Well, you know, I believe the struggle of African American citizens may be slightly different. I remember when many of my Anglo female friends were organizing, that's 1,000 years ago, the feminist movement. And I was approached to join and be engaged in the development of that. I declined because the struggle for us was a people's struggle, not white women fighting against their men, or not fighting, but trying to develop their place in the society as women. We weren't, I don't know if you call it advantaged enough to have that kind of division. Ours was more a concern about the struggle of African American people. Our men were being very discriminated against. So we didn't, as a movement that I was engaged in, we did not run into those kinds of issues of fighting against, of trying to be just women in the struggle. This effort, of course, was not one that was, in my view, as we saw it, pitting black women against black men in Jackson, Mississippi, or just a women's movement. So we were all engaged in that common struggle. I don't know if I made it clear. I'm not trying to draw any morals from it. It's just that our issue as a people historically has been peoplehood.
Because we were the only all-women by, for, of, to piece of the civil rights movement, we were privileged to not really have to deal with that issue. I personally have been a victim of, I don't like to say that word because I never let it get me down, but I certainly had to, have pushed against the glass ceiling all my life in the rest of my political career, professional career, sorry.
Freudian slip.
Wait a second, wait, Betty, wait, I'm sorry, somebody back here that had been, raised her hand a while ago. 1 second.
What was the test?
The old Jim Crow, 21 questions were used against women.
I didn't know that.
Never heard that.
No, my God.
I had to retake it the next day, and I failed because you had to answer put your age as years, months, weeks, and days. And the registrar got to decide how many days it was.
Oh, wow. What?
No, there's
somebody back
back
here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please, you've been very patient. Thank you.
For the ladies that were in Mississippi or studied it, which was, did you form an opinion as to what was unique about Mississippi, population, education, white leadership, that made it particularly a virulent kind of place? Did you put your finger on something that you thought, this is why this went so wrong there?
Well, of course, those were the states that denied us and enslaved us.
Worse than the others?
Excuse me?
Why was Mississippi worse than the others? Well,
I don't.
It was particularly.
Here, you had it.
Okay, well, I think in some ways, was Mississippi worse than the others? I think that when you look at Mississippi, I think there was a couple of things that were going on in Mississippi. One, you had a genius of an organizer, Bob Moses, who had been there on the ground working with local folks for a very long time. And Mississippi was fighting everything. I mean, Mississippi was the place where the Citizens Council, and I was actually corrected by a historian once to not call it the White Citizens Council because they called it the Citizens Council because they figured they were the citizens, right? So, and we just call it the White Citizens Council now because we realize, oh, so we can understand what it is. So I think that was part of it, that they really, in some ways, I don't know if they were worse than Louisiana or Georgia, but they were fighting everything. And I think the other thing is that Mississippi is a very rural state. So you did have a lot of rural areas, so that you did have a lot of the African American population living, as Josie has mentioned, really in a plantation system. Because it was, you were a sharecropper, but you were basically still living in a plantation system. So I think that that may have been why Mississippi was, probably a little bit worse. I know I recently interviewed Andrew Young, and he was talking about Atlanta. And because Atlanta was such a big kind of major metropolitan city, it started to change quicker because of business. So it was bad for Coca-Cola, it was bad for business to have all of this segregation. So they were able to maybe move things a little bit faster, but you can also talk to some people that say, South Georgia was really bad too, but I think you also had Bob Moses who thought, what can we do? How can we break the back of Mississippi? And part of that plan was, let's bring in 1,000 Northern students to do this registration. And so I think you also had that as well, that genius of a mind who was organizing and there on the ground with the folks in Mississippi.
Was your question what was different about Mississippi? Is that what you made it so
Mississippi was the bottom of the heap in every index possible. Health, education, economy. It was the poorest of the poor, and it was isolated. But whites and blacks were cut off from the rest of the country.
And it was mean. You read every day what was going on with black people in Mississippi. We lost a lot of black people to bombings and killings and jailing and denial of jobs. When the Brown decision was being discussed and studied, what we learned during that time, of course, was the amount of oppression that's exercised in all of those southern states. Mississippi was one that modeled cruelty. So there was the need, the fact that Dorothy and others selected Mississippi, in my judgment, was a miracle and a wonderful.
Mississippi selected us. We didn't.
I think it was Clary Harvey who really was.
I want to just add one other thing. There were no repercussions for bad behavior in Mississippi.
The media.
People disappeared and were murdered, and nobody cared. Nobody did anything about it, except for their family members cared, but there was no justice. We went, when the four of us were at the 50th anniversary celebration for Freedom Summer a year and a half ago, and they go through the roll call of all the people who died, and no one brought to justice. Another name, no one brought to justice. And when they were trying to search for the bodies of Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, who disappeared in the western part of the state, and they start dragging rivers they disappeared in the eastern part of the state, they start dragging rivers over in the western part of the state and pulling up all these corpses, dead people, and their hands are shackled or whatever, and these people had been gone for a long time and nothing ever happened. So, why not? They had free reign. That was, I think, a lot of the thinking.
The media were in Jackson. One family, the Hederman family, who were staunch members of the Citizens Council. Thank you for reminding me about that. They owned the television station, they owned the newspaper, they owned the radio station. And when I would be watching national news on a network, and a story about Mississippi, because there were a lot of them that summer, would come up, the screen would go black. Sorry, technical difficulties. And so there was no one knew anything. It really was a know-nothing situation.
And I really want us to think about that, what Debbie just shared.
Yeah.
The fact that nobody cared. And that's why I keep saying such a mean state. You could disappear and nobody cared.
People would be afraid to say you did.
Well, I'm just saying, the family, of course. But there was nothing technically, legally, to protect us. That's a very good point, no, thank you.
Can I say something about the sexist that we skipped over a minute ago?
Okay. Okay, and well, then I'll go right back to you. Oh, okay.
I was going to ask, what was the reactions of husbands or family members when you guys finally came up open with this movement of yours? What were the reactions of family members, even children, husbands, things like that?
Of the local husbands and children, or the husbands and children of the women who came down? I didn't have any. Oh, my grandfather wrote a letter to my father and said, Jack, he'd read a story in Time magazine about a white journalist being beaten in Mississippi, and he wrote this letter and he said, you cannot allow Susie to go. I was his only grandchild. She's got this crazy idea and full of ideas, and this is ridiculous, and the myth of Southern gentlemanliness is just that, and you must not let her go. I was not aware of this correspondence. My father wrote back a 4-page, single-spaced letter. Both of them were on the conservative side. And he said, Dad, I don't want Susie to go any more than you do, but we have raised her to be a responsible person. She is barely over 21, but she is. And if she wanted to marry Fidel Castro, there's nothing I could do about it. And Josie, your story is...
I think I shared with you when Dorothy called and invited me to be a part of the team that went to Jackson. The image that I had of Mississippi was a very scary image. And it was secret. The Attorney General, as I shared with you earlier, insisted that it be secret, that no one knew that you were going to make this trip except your immediate family and his office. So I had 3 daughters, ages 10, 8, and 6. And the decision that we had to make, do you go? Knowing that I could be killed or jailed or anything could happen. And so we had to sit and talk about it, young man. And my husband was very concerned, but he was a very rational human being. So Charles always figured what if and worst case analysis and all the things that could happen if I went. And we talked, and the reasoning between us was that I would have to go. I probably could not live with myself if I hadn't, because my life had been one of an activist in my community. And so the decision was, go. And if we have the worst case, then he would somehow figure it out.
This is something I actually learned from Dr. Harwell and her analysis of it. One of the things that she mentioned is that the meetings usually took place on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so that the women were not required to meet during the weekends. And that's when they, for the Southern women, that's when they would probably be going to their churches if it was on the weekend, or their husbands would be home. So the fact that they did it on the weekend, during the week, also gave them a layer of protection. That because these were women that were homemakers, and so they ran the house, the husbands were gone, so they may not even known that they were having coffee with these radical pearl-wearing, glove-wearing women from the North. So I think that was something. The other thing that I know, there was one... Those were white women, right. The other thing that happened was that I know that there was one woman that husband later divorced her, and in their divorce proceedings, he used the fact that she had been involved in the civil rights movement as part of the divorce proceedings to get custody of the kids. So that was something, and she was one of the Southern Wednesdays women, one of the women that actually hosted a family. Yes.
Still, very much so. And women were not, they were not the head of the household.
Exactly, yeah.
And they deferred, I think, almost across the board to the male. And I would think that there were white women who would have liked to have done that and did not do it because of the male dominance in their family and in society.
One of our angels said how grateful she was to be a widow of independent means.
Megan?
Miss Susie had mentioned earlier about the media not really reporting on what's going on in Mississippi. My question for y'all is, how do you feel about the media today? Because I feel a lot of it is geared towards just kind of stirring up emotion, and it's a lot of black violence and black civilians versus police. And how do you feel about how that's handled today?
We need another 2 days.
Yeah, we've spent a little time since we had our conversation, the four of us, about our great disappointment in the media. And I think we as citizens can do something about that, because we can contact our media, we can write letters to the editor, we can do all of the things that you learn in journalism school and do something. I am very troubled that we just let the media say, do, write, whatever it wants, that we're moving into a period in our own democratic civilization that allows people to be vulgar publicly, and no one speaks of it, that people can tell untruths that are blatant and visible and clear. Media used to raise, I believe, questions about what was just said. That doesn't happen. So there are just a lot of things. If we can take a moment, I think our lives are so busy that we don't really have an opportunity to think about all the things that are going differently in a democracy. And we need to spend some time talking together, speaking out loud, observing things that just, in my view, are destroying our democracy. And we really need to be on point about that. Study it. Don't let it. Talk to your young friends and do something. Do something. Because I think we still can. Write letters.
We also, yes. We also listen to and read people who say what we believe.
That's right.
Exclusively. I am guilty of this as can be, and you know, the prospect of listening to Fox News just gives me the willies. But somehow we need to hear more about and from people who disagree with us.
Do you have anything you want to add to that? No? Oh, no?
Well, I guess this is a question that maybe you can answer, but I guess just what you've experienced, what is your view of the younger generation today and how, I guess, we take up the freedoms or how we utilize those freedoms? Like I know, for example, especially in the African American community, we don't vote, which is something that
We don't feel good about that.
People, died for, I have a very rich history in my family as well, and so it's just crazy, that not even just that, there isn't a knowledge of some of the stuff that people have done to allow us to have these certain freedoms. So how do you guys feel about, I guess, the inaction of the younger generation?
Can I just
address
the voting issue first?
Yeah,
As someone who spent 20 years in almost 20 years in electoral politics, it's not that African Americans don't vote. Americans in general don't vote. And actually, African Americans have a higher percentage of voter participation than most, if you break it down demographically. So that's not really true.
Just for national elections, not for local or state?
That's true, but my overall point is Americans in general do not participate in
We don't
the voting
have a
process.
clue what a privilege this is.
And I think my colleagues have heard me say this, but I believe until people feel that their vote matters, as they did in 2008 in the election of a black president, when you don't feel that your voice matters, and that's what it is when you vote, then you're not likely to do what you need to do to exercise the right to vote. If the weather is bad or if something's not working, then you have an excuse. I feel strongly that there's a need, community, to demonstrate that things are possible and that our children need to know that hard work, discipline, organization matters, and that they have to get over what's happened to our model of all of that, President of the United States of America, who has had the best academic record, family life record, sense of expansion of people and cultural respect, and stands tall and speaks well and can be abused the way he has been. I think there are a lot of young people who wonder, does it matter if you work hard and exercise discipline and have a good family, love your wife, love your children, and smart? And I think we have to, community, prove to young people that it matters. And the way we do that is not only model voting behavior, but we need to interact with our children. We have created an environment in which adults are afraid of their own children, afraid to correct them. I grew up in an environment, my nephew Judson sitting there will tell you, I grew up in an environment anybody in my neighborhood could correct me. I can remember, and I'll say this really quickly, and I remember one day in my town, I was on an escalator, and there were 3 young black girls in front of me. And they were talking to each other in ways that were, I thought, embarrassing. And I said, young ladies, you are too beautiful to talk that way. They turned around and saw it was a black elder, put their hands over their mouth and said, I'm sorry. Now, we are afraid to do that. We're afraid to tell our children, that's not the way you behave, or stop that. And I think we need to go back to being their elders, part of their environment and culture, and teach our children. Because the world is crazy. It's telling things that are not true. They're behaving badly in public. And our children need to be protected from that. So adults, you need to get out there and help our children. Yeah, be the kind of people.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming today and being here, being a part of the panel. Really appreciate it. I want to thank our panelists especially. I think they've given us a lot to think about.